Welcome to our special event today where I'm happy to welcome Fatima Ahmad of the Muslim Justice League. My name is Neil Ahuja. I teach in the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And on behalf of the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies program, the Center for Racial Justice, and the Feminist Studies Department, as well as the Memories of Forgotten Wars Research Cluster, I'm happy to welcome Fatima to this event at UCSC today. Fatima Ahmad is the executive director of the Muslim Justice League in Boston, and she leads Muslim Justice League's efforts to dismantle the criminalization and policing of marginalized communities under national security pretexts. She joined as the deputy director of the organization in 2017 and increased Muslim Justice League's focus on organizing within and collaborating across impacted communities to resist and subvert government surveillance. This included a number of projects, such as the Building the Muslim Power Collective, a group that shifts power through creative actions, and the National Stop CVE Network, which we'll be talking a little bit about today. The name of today's event is Stop CVE, Challenging State Surveillance of Muslims in the Biden-Harris Era. And our event today will have three parts. First, Fatima will discuss a little bit her work with the Muslim Justice League, as well as the history of counterterrorism programs that began with the Obama administration. Then there'll be a dialogue between Fatima and myself about some of the kind of upcoming challenges around countering violent extremism programs. And then third, we'll have a Q&A with the public, and you're welcome to submit questions into the Q&A box if you click that on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So again, thanks so much, Fatima, for joining us today. We're really excited to speak with you. And whenever you're ready, you can start talking a little bit about your work with the Muslim Justice League.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Neil. So happy to be doing this today, and really grateful for everyone tuning in, especially if you're on the West Coast and it's early in the morning. So as Neil said, I am working with Muslim Justice League based in Boston, Massachusetts, and a lot of our work at MJL focuses on this thing called CVE. And I'm sure most of you are wondering, like, what even is that, right? If you've never heard of it before, saying countering violent extremism and then saying that I'm against that can sound really bizarre, right? It's not like I'm pro-violent extremism. So we're going to talk through what CVE is, how it functions, what it's looking like today, and then we'll get into this Q&A. Even if you already know what CVE is, feel free to use some of our language when you're talking about it with other people, because we know it's really, it's a niche topic. It can be difficult to talk about it, especially with our own community, folks who are impacted. So if you find any of this useful, please do use that framing when talking about it with other folks. So the first thing, I know we're in webinar format, so I can't actually see all of you, but I'm going to read out some of the CVE indicators. And I'm going to guess that most of us have, had maybe a time where we've been unemployed. Maybe you've had a sporadic work history. Maybe you've failed to achieve your aspirations, had trouble in romantic relationships, had trouble in your friendships or platonic relationships. Maybe you've experienced some distance from your family. Maybe you've had psychological issues and sought out therapy. So if you are a millennial like me, which I think many of you are probably millennials or Gen Z, you might feel personally attacked by that list, which I do. And, if I was doing my civic duty according to the Department of Homeland Security, where that list came from, I would ask the lovely folks at UCSC to give me a list of everyone who registered for this webinar and let you all know that you are on a path to becoming violent extremists. And I think what we would do, maybe there's like about 70 people in here. So potentially we'd split you up into like 3 groups. Maybe one of those groups we'd say, you all need to see a therapist who is trained by the FBI, and they'll report back to us on how you're doing, just to make sure that we get you off of this path to violent extremism before you do anything terrible, right? We just want to help you out. So we'll be in contact with your therapist, and they'll keep us posted on your progress. Maybe another group of you, maybe the undergrads in particular, the younger folks, we will send you to some trainings where you will hang out with your local police officers and learn how to talk to them better, and understand that any concerns that you have about being profiled are not viable, not justified. And by the end of the program, we'll have you take a survey and let us know if you're now willing to share information about your community with your local police officers. And let's say, the third group of you, we will have you attend basically a soccer tournament or a basketball tournament held at your local faith institution, maybe a mosque, who knows, but I'm gonna say it's probably a mosque. And it's just a tournament, it's just a sports event. There's no harm in that, right? But you don't know that the funding for that tournament is coming from Homeland Security, and the whole idea is that somehow you playing sports with other people like you will prevent you all from becoming terrorists. So if that all sounds disgusting and terrifying, I'm glad. And that's what CVE is. That's actually how it functions today, and those are all real examples of what it looks like today across the country. So what is that though? Like, how is it that they justify these programs? How is it that they have so much funding to do this? It's based on this idea that if you have radical ideology or extremist ideas, extreme politics, extreme behaviors, that you are likely to commit violence in the future, and that we can somehow identify somebody who has those politics and then prevent them from committing violence in the future. The reality is that's not scientifically justified. And even the people who do CVE will always have a disclaimer that tell you that. So the same place that I got those indicators that I read out earlier also says this. Having one or more risk factors does not mean an individual will engage in targeted violence or terrorism. So let me say that again. Having one or more risk factors does not mean an individual will engage in targeted violence or terrorism. And yet you have millions of dollars of programs training the people that you should trust. So your imams, your religious leaders, your local nonprofits, your teachers, your therapists, and deputizing them and telling them, hey, use these risk factors. Look at your local community, look at everyone around you, and identify who you think is radical and who you think will become violent. So when that happens, right, when people who are in helping professions in particular are approached and told that this is going to help the community, right, and that this is going to help people before they get involved with law enforcement, before anything bad happens, that's really enticing. it's hard for people to identify like what that actually is and the problems behind it, because it's wrapped in this nice like candy coating. It seems really fluffy. It's community policing. You know, who doesn't want that? But what we're actually doing is institutionalizing how we profile people. So if you all remember a pretty like widely known case that happened in the US of a young boy named Ahmed who built a clock and brought it to school, and his teacher called the cops on him. Again, personally offended because I was an engineer and a nerd growing up. So I absolutely would have done something like that. What CVE would do is institutionalize what happened there, right? That teacher probably was not trained by a CVE program, because that was pretty early on in the CVE framework in the US. But CVE would actually justify that, right? And have even more teachers and other folks using that kind of lens to criminalize the people around them. So you're going to hear us talk a lot at MJL about how we criminalize people, because on the spectrum of, you know, policing and incarceration, what leads to the policing and incarceration of our people is being criminalized, right? The social cultural ways that we look at each other, that we talk about each other. So the next thing we want to talk through is like, how do we talk about each other? I'm imagining that most of you have seen some op-eds recently about whether or not to call people terrorists, specifically the people who attacked the Capitol. I am here to tell you, please don't call them terrorists. Call them white supremacists, call them fascists, call them white nationalists. Don't call them terrorists. Don't call them extremists. Probably don't call them radical either. Those are three words that are consistently used by law enforcement in this ambiguous, both sides kind of way, right? When we hop on that train of wanting to say, yeah, there's extremists on both sides, that's the same thing as Trump saying, well, there's very fine people on both sides, and there's also bad people on both sides, right? Biden said it, our governor of Massachusetts said it, there's violent people on both sides. That is my personal pet peeve, is this idea that there are two ends of the spectrum, and both ends of those spectrum are equally bad and equally violent, equally powerful. What we're actually talking about is white supremacy, so call it what it is. We're talking about white supremacy, and we're talking about reactions to white supremacy. So violence that upholds white supremacy, like what we saw in the Capitol attack, is not extreme, right? That's why nobody is calling it terrorism. That's why it hasn't been addressed already. It's pretty normal. Like, unfortunately, that's the world we live in. It's not extreme. What is deemed extreme, right, is a person named Fatima quitting her job as an engineer to become a community organizer and fight the FBI and actually fight for the rights of my community. That is what is called extreme. And that's historically, for at least 100 years, what the FBI has called extreme. You know, they would call me extreme, they've called Malcolm X extreme, and a lot of that actually started around the 1930s, that kind of language of calling Muslims, Black folks, Japanese folks, extreme or radical for actually standing up for their rights. So according to the FBI, Black Muslims who were against white supremacy in the 1930s were fanatics of racial equality. I'm a fanatic of racial equality. You can quote me on that. There's nothing wrong with that, right? If we're actually talking about white supremacy versus racial justice, that's a much better framing than, oh, there's just both sides, and somehow being in the middle, being moderate is a good thing. Being moderate to me is honestly just really lazy, and really like unproductive and gets in the way of actually standing up for justice, whether it's racial justice, queer and trans justice, like whatever it is that's on the other side of the system. So that's, one of the key things is that they're using this vague language because, also who gets to define what's extreme, right? Like who defines what's radical or what is terrorism? For us, it's not effective to try to fight to get those words back. We don't need those words, right? We can call it what it is and call it white supremacy. What we don't need is equal opportunity surveillance. We don't need CVE to apply to white people too. That's not going to solve the problem because CVE doesn't address violence. It just perpetuates it, again, under this like fluffy, vague language, which is just going to perpetuate the surveillance of Muslim folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks, immigrant folks, LGBTQ folks, especially those of us who are actually standing up for justice. So we're going to talk about this, a little bit more between me and Neil, but I hope that that is, a pretty good basic, overview of what CVE actually looks like. One of the things, I'll put this in the chat, that you can use if you want to learn more or like dig into any parts of what I just talked about, is this just nice 2-page primer that we have about CVE. So I'll put that in the chat.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Fatima. And the next part of the event will be a little bit of a discussion between myself and Fatima. And in the meantime, those of you who are in the audience should feel free to throw your question into the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom panel there. We will get to those in about 10 minutes or so, but first I have a few questions for Fatima. And the first one of these deals with the current context of the recent transition since the Biden-Harris administration has come in. One of the things that was kind of suggested in their campaign materials was that they were going to work to redress some of the racist legacies of programs like CVE and its successor program under the Trump administration. I'm going to briefly share my screen here to show a piece of their platform. So if I can get the technology to work, it'll be here. This is a quote from the campaign materials, and it comes from Joe Biden and the Arab American Community, a Plan for Partnership. That document is available online if you want to look at it in full. Here's the passage that relates to CVE. A Biden-Harris administration will confront discriminatory policies that single out Arab Americans and cast entire communities under suspicion. Additionally, the new administration will work to protect communities that are under siege from the growing threat of violence from white supremacists and incitement to violence by far-right extremists. Biden will end the Trump administration's targeted violence and terrorism prevention program, and before developing new prevention programs, he will conduct a thorough review of past programs and regularly consult with leaders from historically targeted communities, including Arab Americans, to ensure that civil rights are protected. He will ensure that programs are properly oriented towards actual threats based on data. This will include creating a dialogue with Arab American community leaders on issues of surveillance, policing, and counterterrorism, in tandem with other communities historically affected by securitized relationships with the US government. And the question I wanted to ask Fatima, this language suggests that the Biden-Harris administration is going to reform anti-radicalization programs like CVE in order to be less discriminatory. They're now also going to target white supremacists, for example. And they're also suggesting that there will be Arab American representatives who will have a say on how the new programs work. What's your view on such efforts to reform CVE and to include leaders of the community in counterterrorism planning?
Yeah, it's bullshit, is my opinion. And it's very obviously bullshit if you looked at their other policy documents. So that was what was in the Arab American policy document, but in other documents, they talked about expanding CVE to fight white supremacy. So you'll see in there, they also named it Trump administration's Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program. That's basically the new name of CVE. It's CVE 2.0. They're not addressing that CVE was started by the Obama administration when Biden was vice president. That Kamala Harris, our new vice president, had, an entire CVE plan as part of her campaign when she was running for president still. And that actually, what happened under the Trump administration was that a Democrat from New Jersey pushed to bring CVE back. So CVE is really, it's been like a cornerstone of the Democrats and supposedly progressive folks, right? Who want to be seen as tough on policing without being too tough, right? It's one thing to be like overtly policing and surveilling folks, but instead, if you push for soft counterterrorism, which is what CVE is, or community policing, that's somehow better. So they're not actually addressing how they have propped this up for many years themselves. And as exciting as it was to see that, like, that is still a really significant change in rhetoric, right? To even have that included in the Arab American policy document was significant. But the administration, already is flip-flopping on that. Just yesterday, I think NBC was reporting that DHS under Biden's administration is going to expand those grants, supposedly to counter domestic terrorism, which is a really bizarre way of saying that, Muslims, those are the foreign terrorists, and white people are the domestic terrorists. So even that idea of like calling it domestic violent extremism or domestic terrorism is turning Muslims into, the foreign other, and they're the other side of, of the scale. So we're really concerned that what's going to happen is they'll end one form of it and just have 5 other versions of CVE pop up with new names that supposedly address white supremacy. But any extension or expansion of DHS is an expansion of white supremacy. There is no, reformation of these programs that are going to make them effective at actually ending white supremacy. Our take on it is you actually need to defund law enforcement, and that includes Homeland Security as the entire institution, to really address white supremacy, including the kind of white supremacist violence that folks saw in January. And happy to expand on that more as well if it's helpful, but excited to answer some of these other questions too.
Thanks so much. And yeah, we will get more into the questions. I see 3 of them have been posted either in the chat or the Q&A. So please keep sending those in, especially to the Q&A tab if you can. One of the other kind of things I wanted to ask about has to do with our context in California, right? So across the University of California system, there have been a number of organizations established to research and challenge the relationships between the university and policing. And so that's one of the contexts in which we're having this event today, is that there's a broader dialogue happening over policing and surveillance in the UC system. One of the things I noticed in looking at the Trump era funded CVE grants is that four of them were located in California. One of them, for example, in the Alameda Sheriff's Office, which works to work against which works to address using mental health professionals, formerly incarcerated Muslims in the East Bay. And then there were a couple of programs that focus on schools in Los Angeles and San Diego, and one that funds national efforts among police organizations to implement CVE. I wanted to look specifically at those CVE programs that aim at schools. And because youth are often targeted in CVE programs, could you speak a little bit about what measures have been used to surveil students, and what can the public do to address the roles of universities and K through 12 schools in CVE projects as they currently stand?
Yeah, such a good question. Youth are maybe one of the largest groups that are targeted by CVE. There have been some, numbers coming out from DHS evaluating that set of grants that showed that a lot of the participants were that were targeted were youth or the parents of those youth. I think youth are hyper surveilled, especially today. Like, I'm just so glad that I didn't grow up with social media. But I think, regardless of the internet, just being in school, especially K through 12 schools, like, students don't have that many rights, right? They're really subjected to so much policing, not just from law enforcement, but from the school administration, from the teachers, from social workers even, that are at those schools. What we're seeing with CVE is, there's two things that are happening. So one is targeting of youth, who are in high school, middle school, K through 12, through some of these programs. And that really models what has happened in the UK, where Prevent, which is sort of the sister program, or maybe even the father program to CVE, has actually resulted in like a legal mandate that public workers have to report on extremism. So one example is here in Massachusetts. There's a nonprofit that was started by some undergraduate students at University of Massachusetts in Lowell. Those students were in the counterterrorism department there and started this CVE program that targets youth, like middle school, high school kids. They go in and basically teach teachers and parents how to identify radicalism. And they continue to be supported by the counterterrorism department at UMass Lowell. So that actually shows both ends of it, right? So you have the kids themselves who are in K through 12 schools, being, potentially targeted by their teachers, except that their teachers think that they're doing the right thing, right? And then you have the university support of it as well. So a lot of CVE grants actually go to universities, and they're not always like as obvious as the ones that you mentioned. There's a lot of additional funding that comes from the Department of Justice and Homeland Security to these universities to prop up CVE. So you basically have a set of academics who are just making so much money and making a nice cushy career out of pushing for more CVE. Those same academics will say, oh, it's like CVE hasn't been that effective, but we should continue doing it anyway. So I don't know, it's very bizarre to me that nobody questions how Homeland Security is funding academics to evaluate and prop up this thing that Homeland Security wants to do. No one's really questioning the bias there. But I think the UC system, California, and not just the UC schools, I think there's a couple of other schools there, are a big part of it, as well as the schools here in Massachusetts and Boston.
Thanks. One more question from me before the broad.
Neil, I think you froze for a second.
Thank you. I'll start over with that question. CVE was rolled out in the Obama and Trump years at the same time that mass movements to challenge incarceration and violent policing were forming around the US. Can you talk about how the Muslim Justice League has done work to challenge CVE in the context of those broader abolitionists and racial justice movements?
Yeah, I think, that's one of the things that has been a strength of MJL is, we don't see our base of people as just Muslims. We know that CVE, is targeting Muslims right now as like the frontline community of the war on terror. But there's no difference between that and how Japanese Americans were incarcerated previously, how, Black Americans, including Black Muslims, have been, policed and surveilled by the FBI. And that's also really clear on the end of the police, right? They tie us all together. Some of those early surveillance documents from the FBI, they're literally worried about our communities coming together to build power together, because then we are really powerful, right? And we're a threat to the system of white supremacy. So that's like a core, principle for us at MJL, and a core value of how we do our organizing is understanding how this is part of the larger system of criminalizing, policing, surveilling all communities. So one of the parallels that we've worked on in Boston that has gotten a lot of traction is the gang database. Which is very much, at least here in Boston, and I think many other cities, has like a list of indicators. Some of it is what clothes you're wearing, who you know, and a lot of it is just law enforcement saying that you're a gang member without being questioned. So it functions the same way. And here in Boston, what you see is, Somali and Moroccan youth being targeted, profiled by CVE, and then, Black and like Central American youth in particular getting profiled by the gang database. So when you go into a high school classroom and talk with youth about that, they know, right? They know that they're being policed. They know that this cop down the street is harassing them. They don't necessarily know that there's a database or a CVE program behind it. But that kind of solidarity is really, really powerful. So our organizing here in Boston and in Massachusetts has been, in collaboration with other groups who are pushing for, youth jobs instead of police funding, who are ending the incarceration of women and girls, who are trying to end the gang database and get ICE out of our city. So we see that as, all part of the same system. And we've been, I think, really effective organizing together because we're able to name that for our communities and build that kind of solidarity.
Great. I'd love to move us into the Q&A. And I want to just note one of the one of the posts in here comes from Dana O'Neill, who is with Students in Communities Against Policing and Surveillance. And that is, they're sharing an email address and resource. Can you see that in the Q&A? So if anybody is interested in working on California-based efforts to challenge CVE, that is available, and I'll share it in the chat as well. Maybe which one should we go to next? Here is a question from Melanie. What does international solidarity look like at Muslim Justice League? Does your organizing also center anti-imperialist action?
Yeah, I wish that we could do all of the things, but we're a very small team. There was previously just one of us for quite some time, and now there's three of us at MJL on staff. So we're expanding our capacity, but I think one of the things that happens is, you know, Muslims, like, we're the most diverse faith community in the US, and many Muslims are tied to communities abroad, right? Many of us are immigrants or have some immigrant background. Not all, right? Again, there's like a long legacy of Black Muslims in the US, but it's really hard to address all the issues, right? Like, whether it's, you know, the incarceration of Uyghur Muslims or Palestine, or just, you know, the Rohingya Muslims, like all of the things. So at MJL, our scope really is focused on what is happening here domestically in the US. Although we have a lot of, you know, relationship with folks in the UK who have been doing similar organizing, because we've learned a lot from what they've done against Prevent there in the UK.
Thank you. We have a question from Fahad. It's asking, the scale of CVE programs in the US relative to total counterterrorism policing appears to be relatively small, for example, compared to the UK. There was one cycle of Homeland Security CVE funding in 2016, and then the TVTP grants under Trump in 2020. It also seems that the 2020 funding under Trump is less Muslim focused than the Obama funding. Do you think DHS funded CVE programs capture the full extent of preemptive or community facing CVE programs in the US? Are there state and municipal efforts underway that we're simply not aware of?
Yeah, such a good question. There's so much CVE that you don't know about. That's the short answer. So people focus on DHS for some reason, but the Department of Justice was actually the department that started CVE. So Boston was one of the pilot cities, and the funding for that original, like, initial implementation of CVE came from DOJ. So one, you know, what we've seen is the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security have a bunch of CVE infrastructure. There's also, you know, the State Department doing tons of CVE, mostly abroad. And then you also have local governments taking it on. So the state of California, for example, has its own, I think, CVE or PVE that they're calling it, um, programming there, which Dana, I don't know if Dana can, I don't know if attendees can share in the chat, but Dana, who mentioned, you know, the Students Against Surveillance Coalition, could speak to that more too. So what's happened is that federal implementation has then, like, proliferated at the state and local level. So you have lots of, for example, local nonprofits doing CVE that could get funding from federal government, sure, but they can also get their own funding to do it. So it's not just about being funded by DHS, it's really about the core programming that's happening. And, you know, behind the grants that go out, like, when they're sending $10 million of grants out, the budget for that whole department for the year is $80 million, right? Like, there's a bunch of staff. They're trying to create, I think they're hiring CVE coordinators around the country. So there's like one in Atlanta, they're going to have regional coordinators. So it's not just about those grants, it's this huge infrastructure that is actually useless at addressing violence.
We have a question in the chat from Navad Aziz. Thank you, Fatima, for your presentation. If I understand you correctly, the Muslim community should take an anti-CVE position. While I can appreciate that, my question is, in denouncing CVE, the very few bad apples that do exist in the community, how can the community actually help them and prevent their escalation? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the question that comes up a lot. So what do we do about violence? So one, we're not unique in needing to address violence. Like, that is one of the big problems with CVE, is this idea that Muslims somehow have a problem that nobody else does, right? If you actually frame that correctly, you can see how racist that is, to assume that Muslims somehow have more violence that needs to be addressed than other groups, and that we need to do that on our own or with law enforcement support. So the way that we address violence, we as in everybody, is actually looking at the root cause. What CVE does is it really pathologizes and individualizes the issue, right? It's really a band-aid solution to a much bigger problem. Like the idea that we're somehow going to identify every individual who's going to commit an act of violence, that is just nowhere near as effective as actually looking at the root issues, which are white supremacy, for example, but also, the violence of inequity. So one of these programs that happened in Boston targeted Somali youth. It's the one that I mentioned earlier where I said, I'll have undergrads hang out with police officers and learn how to talk to them better. That was literally what was happening to Somali youth here in Boston. In the CVE application for that $500,000 program, so $500,000, they say that over 90% of Somalis in Boston live in public or subsidized housing. And then they go on to justify giving $500,000 to a nonprofit that does law enforcement work to, again, get these kids to hang out with the police instead of, I don't know, defunding Homeland Security and actually making sure that all of us have housing and healthcare and education and all of the things that we actually need. Not only are those the things that we need, those are the things that we know actually reduce violence. Like, that cannot be argued against. So what we're saying is, like, yes, we want therapists, of course, we want basketball programs, we want housing. None of that should be because we're seen as ticking time bombs and we're only being given that because we're somehow dangerous and prone to violence. That is nonsense. There is no community that is prone to violence, right? More than other people based on that. There are systemic issues, though, that have to be addressed. And at the communal level, what we need to do is find ways to pull people in rather than stigmatizing them, right? So, saying that, oh, we think that person is extremist and they need to go to this de-radicalization program, like that's not going to help. I highly recommend looking at the reports from CAGE in the UK. So because it's actually a mandate in the UK government that people have to report on it, you have hundreds of people every year getting reported, especially young kids, for ridiculous things, like really offensive cases that happen there. So I would recommend, looking at their work because they have so much more data, because they're unfortunately ahead of us with implementing it. So that's a really good example of how it actually creates more violence rather than building up community and creating a culture of care instead of a culture of policing.
I'm going to combine two questions from Brianna Offray and Joe Rivano Barros. Both of them are asking about the role of tech companies in CVE. Do you know if there are any issues with data being sold that could be used in CVE programs, or are Silicon Valley companies involved at this time?
Yes. So Facebook in particular, I think, has sponsored some CVE competitions where they've given out funding. We don't know if there's data being sold yet, but I expect that that's going to happen. And why that is there are some CVE programs or institutions that are really big on this like tech version of CVE and doing this through social media. One really good example, because this is another pet peeve of mine, is life after hate. So if folks remember, after the Charlottesville like white supremacist rally and violence, a lot of people said, oh, but the Trump administration, they removed this group from CVE, and that group was going to take down white supremacy. My tone is because that's bullshit, and nobody actually read what that group planned on doing. What that group was going to do was use your Facebook profiles to identify about 200 people that they thought would either become a jihadist or a far-right extremist, and then contact those people so that they can help de-radicalize them. They were going to do that through a semi-automated algorithm that I think a group called Moonshot CVE has created. So one, people didn't question, this group said they're fighting white supremacy, but they're not. And there were plenty of us who had already said, like, this is not a way to actually address it. And they were going to use, our social media to actually do that. We've also seen, YouTube and I think other big companies try automating CVE, right? By either like flagging content that's violent and taking it down, or trying to like take people down a different rabbit hole. There's this idea that if you're on YouTube, I know that this actually happens, right? You can go down some weird rabbit holes, right? So they think that, if you start watching certain violent content and then you get a message, like the next video is redirecting you towards love instead of hate, that will solve white supremacy. And again, my tone is because it doesn't work that way. I happen to be somebody who grew up, and I think hopefully this will address our dear friend Jess, their question about who should fight white supremacy. Also really glad to have, friends attending this. I grew up in Appalachia. Like, I grew up in Trump country, in coal country, in like hella racist neo-Nazis that I knew growing up, like kind of place. I also grew up in the town where Lindy England and like the military company that committed the atrocities at Abu Ghraib, like they are from my hometown. So I really know what it looks like at multiple levels to face white supremacist violence. I know what it was like to be in the 9th grade and be harassed by people who, had swastikas tattooed on them, or who had a family history of being involved in the KKK, and what it also looks like at a systemic level. These programs will not address that. The FBI is not going to show up and help some kid that I grew up with off the path to becoming a white nationalist. What will actually work is defunding and demilitarizing this country in terms of law enforcement, right? So defunding law enforcement and demilitarizing, because people that I grew up with also had one of two big options: join the military to get out of Cumberland, or work at one of the two prisons that was built in our town. And those are revolving doors of white supremacy. So we know that actually, reducing the scope of law enforcement in the military, not only will that, help with the really obvious violence against people of color that those institutions perpetuate, but it's also going to cut off that revolving door of people becoming like overtly white supremacist and overtly white nationalist, through those systems, through that being their only option. So when we say defund, that is actually going to provide better opportunities for everyone by making sure that we all have the things that we need to survive, and not fueling these systems, which Homeland Security is a big part of that system.
Thanks so much for that answer and for addressing Jess's question. If there are other young people who are in the event, feel free to throw your questions into the chat as well. Um, the answer you were giving kind of builds in the direction of Christine Hong's question, which is like, in practical terms, what does a defund DHS campaign look like? How can we organize across myriad struggles, given the purpose of DHS is to actually wage multi-directional wars? How can we do that in solidarity?
Yeah, that is something a bunch of us who have been working on the Stop CVE organizing are thinking about. Um, Many of us have seen folks calling for abolishing ICE, which is, a new thing, right? That happened post 9/11, the creation of DHS and the creation of ICE. And what we want to see happen is that kind of solidarity and like larger scale campaign, right? Of saying, actually, it's DHS, right, that needs to go. It's not just ICE. One of the things we're seeing right now is people thinking like, oh, if we give more funding to DHS and get their investigative analysts to focus on white supremacy, that's going to help. It's not going to help. Those same people are the ones harassing kids in Boston because they think that they're gang members and then getting them deported. So what we need to do is, I think build that kind of larger vision. It doesn't mean that tomorrow or this year we're going to be able to abolish like Homeland Security. Anything's possible, but I don't think that is probable. But if we actually say that that's our vision, and that stopping CVE and abolishing ICE are two steps that get us towards that vision, that is much stronger than Muslim folks doing organizing around CVE, other folks doing organizing around ICE, other people worried about local law enforcement. Because again, it's one system, so we are much stronger when we have that bigger vision together.
One question that emerges out of some of the classes that are going on in the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies program here at UC Santa Cruz is about how to think about contemporary forms of racism as they affect Muslim communities and other communities, and how to create connections and build solidarities. So, one kind of narrative that you sometimes hear about racism and state surveillance affecting Muslims is that it's not racism because it's religion, and it can't be racism because there's so much racial diversity within the Muslim community. Famously, Rupert Murdoch once said, well, Fox News's coverage of the wars is not racist. Arabs are white. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that you or Muslim Justice League thinks about the racial diversity of the Muslim community, and how it might help us understand the interrelation between race and religion more broadly.
Yeah. Oh, that is the topic that a lot of folks have not figured out yet. And I will plug our dear friend Atia Hussein, who is maybe on here actually, who's done really, really great work around that topic. Because yeah, that is a thing that gets thrown at us all of the time. Is, well, we're talking about religion, we're not talking about race. Or yeah, Muslims are clearly committing so much violence, and that's why it's getting coverage, which there's a lot out there, a lot of data that shows like that's not actually the case, right? But facts don't matter. People don't actually care about data and facts. So for one of the people in the Q&A who was asking about how to talk to people on the other side, that is something to know. Facts don't matter, but your narrative matters. So when we think about Muslims, like, yes, we're the most diverse faith community in the US. We have Muslims from everywhere, right? And like anybody could be Muslim, but also Muslims are clearly racialized in certain ways, right? there is an assumption that people who look a certain way must be Muslim based on their ethnicity or background or even their cultural clothes, which is part of CVE. Like one of the indicators is, you know, wearing a hijab, growing a beard. Those are, you know, assumed to be indicators of religiosity. I think, you know, in terms of solidarity, like it is really hard because I think folks in a lot of our communities also assume that Muslims are foreign and that we're bringing all of this like backwards foreign culture with us and that we really do have to address it. Um, so I think that there is an erasure of history of not only how Muslims have been policed here in the US historically, but also how that's tied to, you know, the global forever war on terror that has been happening, right? That, you know, at least since 9/11 has been unending, but is clearly also connected to like longer histories of colonization. So that is not an easy thing to explain to people. But I think helping people understand how anti-Muslim systems bring xenophobia, Orientalism, and anti-Black racism together has been one of the more effective ways to talk about it. Like rather than saying it's racism, it's not racism, understanding like, okay, it's complicated, so let's think about the different things that are coming into the system and how it plays out differently, right? Like at an individual level, white supremacist violence could look like somebody attacking, you know, a South Asian person or a Sikh man, assuming that they're Muslim based on how they look. It can also look like the FBI actually knowing, like, you're Muslim and you've been really religious and you're going to this mosque and coming to your door specifically because of your religiosity. So those two things are connected, even though, you know, both people are not Muslim.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a really helpful, complicated answer. um, our final question is about how white students at UCSC and you know, white people in general can support Muslim struggles for liberation.
Yeah, I think you know, one thing that I see from a lot of activists, leftists in particular, often white leftists, is concern about how these things will impact them without actually building solidarity with the communities who are already impacted. So just on Twitter in the past few days, I've seen, you know, leftists, activists, so on, commenting on these expansions of CVE, like, oh, they're gonna come for us. Sure, but they came for my father, you know, long before I got involved in MJL's work, right? They show up at Muslim people's homes regularly, regardless of organizing. So what you need to do is, you know, build solidarity. I think that there are a lot of ways to actually get involved in community-based organizing that are outside of the typical like allyship concept. Like, I don't need you all to stand on the sidelines and only show up in certain ways, but you do need to build trust with the communities who are really heavily impacted and show up, you know, regularly. So I think that, you know, getting involved with the local organizations that are taking it on. So if you're in Southern California, I think Dana, you know, said this, although she used the, I don't know if she explicitly said the name. So Palestinian Youth Movement, Vigilant Love, MSA West, which is where Dana is at, Stop LAPD Spying. Those are some of the groups in Southern California that you can get involved with that are doing organizing both on campus and off campus. In Boston, it's Muslim Justice League, it's Families for Justice is Healing, Youth Justice and Power Union. I guess any organization that has the word justice in its name might be a good place to start. Getting involved with that local organizing and really following the leadership of folks who are both impacted and have analysis. Like it's the two things together. I also want to just address, since it's like in the comments to the panelists, this idea that like China is doing a different version of the war on terror. What we are seeing with CVE is like it's a global thing that has really started in the UK, the US, but has expanded across the world. And it looks slightly differently everywhere. But China pretty explicitly says that it is following what the US has done in terms of the war on terror. And that's what we're seeing with Uyghur Muslims. So that is another example. Like you can look to what's happened in the UK, or you can look to what's happening in China as like, that's the path that CVE is on. I'm not on a path to radical violence. CVE is on a path to internment of Muslim folks, or, mass profiling and surveillance of Muslim youth and Muslim families. So yeah, I think it's really useful actually to look at those examples of what might happen with CVE in the US in the future.
Well, we are about out of time, so I wanted to thank you one more time, Fatima, for joining us today. This was a really amazing discussion. And I love especially that we were able to create some links and resources for doing the I guess, in order to do that as well. But thanks again for joining us today. And we will see you all who are attending at the next Center for Racial Justice event. Have a good day.
Thank you.